Beste mensen, heel hartelijk welkom hier vanavond in de Geertekerk voor de Vrijzinnige Lezing van 2026 met Ulrich Schmiedel en een reactie van Dorothea Notch. Wij volgen eigenlijk het programma zoals dat is uitgereikt. Met na de lezing van Ulrich Schmiedel een muzikaal intermezzo. Er is een boekentafel en de uitgever heeft gezegd, terecht gezegd volgens mij, dat er eigenlijk niemand zonder een boek naar huis kan. En er liggen boeken van die te maken hebben met de Engelstalige lezingen van de afgelopen periode. Dus ze zijn van harte aan te bevelen ook, denk ik. U hebt een muntje gekregen voor de consumptie na de borrel. Dat zijn een paar zakelijke mededelingen, zal ik maar zeggen, die ik graag als eerste wilde doen. En dan ga ik heel graag over naar de introductie van Ulrich Schmiedel. Because it is my pleasure and honor to introduce Ulrich Schmiedel, who will deliver this year's liberal lecture this evening. Ulrich Schmiedel studied theology in Leipzig and Glasgow, was awarded the Kurt Noack Prize in 2012 when he finished his studies in Leipzig. He wrote his dissertation at Oxford in 2016 and his habilitation thesis in 2021 in Munich, for which he received the Habilitationspreis in the Humanities from the Münchner Universitätsgesellschaft. Schmiedel was a lecturer in systematic theology in Munich, a senior lecturer in theology, politics and ethics in Edinburgh, and is now professor of global Christianities in Lund. Schmiedel has authored and edited several books, and numerous articles were written by him. The focus of his work currently lies in public and political theology, with a strong interest in the role of religion in the public sphere. His research was situated at the intersection of theology, sociology, anthropology, and philosophy. A significant portion of his research is currently focused on faith-based refugee relief in Europe. So you can understand that we are very happy to have him here tonight. And please give a warm welcome to Ulrich Schmiedel for his lecture, Vrijzinnigheid as a Matter of Survival, Public Theology in the Age of Migration. Ulrich Schmiedel, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm also really grateful, Rick, that you read out this Dutch word for me, so I don't have to try now to say, but I tried once, so I'd say Vrijzinnigheid as a matter of survival is my topic. Before I jump in, I really want to say thank you to the organizers of this lecture, but also we had a workshop in the afternoon. Some good debates have already been going on, and my mind is quite full of this, and some of it I'll try to actually sneak into the lecture now. So we'll take it from there. This is good to have these papers, I have to say. Thank you. I might have gotten a little bit into the talk, but at a certain point I would have missed them, I think. Thanks. Okay, for people who are forced to flee their homes and they're trying to get into the European Union, the Balearic Islands, that's what you see in the background there, are a new entry point into the European Union. You know that the routes that people on the move take to get into Europe, they're constantly shifting, and the Balearic route is a new sort of hotspot route in a way. And human rights organizations who work there, like, for instance, La Camino Fronteras, Walking Borders, and they sort of kind of work against human rights violations in the area. They say that this route along the Balearic Islands, so it's people coming basically via Algiers, from where they take boats that they hope will carry them up to the Balearic Islands and then with that into the European Union's territory. Human rights organizations that work there say what we see in terms of policies in that area, that is really in a way the test case for migration policies to come in the European Union, because it's a route that people don't know so much about, so it's a little bit off the attention from the media. So this is what we are going to get most likely. And what we're going to get is a distinction between two types of rescue policies. So they talk about this as active and passive rescue policies. Active rescue policy means that when a boat is gone missing, what happens is one maps out a search area, then sends air assets, like planes. They try to locate in order to then send ships that can rescue the people whose life is in danger. That's the active policy. The passive policy looks a bit differently. Passive policy means that no search area is mapped out, no plane or anything is sent. There's still the objective to locate, to rescue, but it is done basically by contacting other vessels that are in the areas to say, please keep a lookout for people. And I guess now it's fairly obvious which kind of policy is applied to which kind of people. If there are boats with people on the move, with migrants, refugees, if they receive any rescue at all, it is this type of passive rescue rather than active rescue. So Helena Maleno, who is the co-founder of that group that is sort of really active in this area, she says, we have been announcing for some time that the Balearic route is one of the routes where there is the greatest arbitrariness when it comes to activating protocols for the protection of life at sea. It is a laboratory of the necro frontier, of death policies. So this is the situation we are confronted with in Europe. And I think one question that comes to mind when you think through these types of policies of death that are put into place is, are we human? That's the question I want to think about with you today, the question I want to ask and in a way also try to answer. But I think we can look at these questions from two different angles. The we in the question of are we human, I think, is interesting. You can look at this from the perspective of the people who are trying to get from the outside in. If you look at the kind of necro frontier they are facing, the question is, are they really human? Are they really treated like human beings? But you can also flip the perspective and look at the we in are we human from the perspective of people who are looking from the inside out. So given the necro frontier and the fabrication of these death policies, the fortification of the border, we can also ask here, are these people really human? And I think the catch about phrasing a question like this is to say there is no neutral we in that position. You are either in or you're out, but there's no neutral stance here. You have to make a choice where you stand. And I think that's the moment where these death policies become relevant for us as well. And it's in a way the moment you need to start thinking through what is happening here. So even if you're in a nice city, say Utrecht for example, far away from these borders, these kinds of policies are put in place in our name, with our tax payments. This is what the European Union puts in place there. And as Rick said, I work in public theology, and I like to think of public theology really as the theology in the public sphere. So if you ask me where to find theology, I would say you can find it pretty much everywhere if you just look long and hard enough. And that means we also have to think through theology in the context of being Europeans, being within the European Union, being Europeans, and thinking through that the European Union, of which we are part, puts these death policies in place. So it's an active policy of letting people die. And the argument I want to make, so you can see the ghostly figure of the public theologian sitting at his laptop. Of course, there's no resemblance to me whatsoever there. The argument I want to make tonight is this. Any answer to the double question, are we human, has to do with theology. There are ways of doing public theology that do lend themselves to this type of dehumanization. And then there are ways of doing public theology that don't lend themselves to this dehumanization, or at least don't lend themselves so easily to this type of dehumanization that we see at the European border. And the difference between these two types of public theology, and I guess you guessed this is a liberal lecture after all, so I should say something about liberal theology. The case I want to make to you is that the difference between these two types of theology really has something to do with the liberal theological legacy. So this is what you're in for the next 40 minutes or so. But it's also something that in a way lets me pause before I even really start, because in a way we have to think about liberal legacies rather than a liberal legacy in the singular. So we have to sort this out a little bit before we can jump into this. In Why Everyone Hates White Liberals, including white liberals, Kevin Schultz, as a historian, makes the case that how one defines a white liberal is really just a Rorschach test for one's own political allegiances. And the book cover, I've put it there. If you actually hold the book in your hand, it's made like a mirror. So you look at the cover of the book and you see yourself, your own face in it. And that's the case he's trying to make. So you can criticize liberalism from the political left, saying they're destroying everything that's woke and weak, but you can also criticize liberalism from the political right, saying they're defending everything that's woke and weak. In the end, what happens is liberalism as a term gets hollowed out, and it's really applying the label of liberalism to something or someone is already enough of a criticism. You don't need to actually engage any type of content. And Schultz says really in the US you can see this kind of strategy of labeling starting already in the 1960s. First it's the political right that attacks liberals like this, and then it's the political left. And now this has gone so far that even white liberals don't want to be called white liberals anymore. And he concludes, it is time for Americans to stop trying to revitalize the image of the liberal. Many have tried, all have failed. Liberal is after all just a word. Wither the white liberal. Rest in peace. They had a good run. Now it's time to imagine a future without them. What you see in this quote, I think at least, is that in a way Kevin Schultz gives away that he's also just a white liberal hating these white liberals with this kind of conclusion. Now, of course, political liberalism doesn't map onto theological liberalism, and what is happening in the US does not necessarily map onto what is happening in Europe. But I think there's something interesting here. If you look at the term liberal theology, at least at the time when German theology was sort of field-defining still, Rudolf Bultmann actually coined that term, and with the definite article, the liberal theology. And he coined it to distinguish this camp of liberal theologians from a camp of less liberal theologians that included himself. So from the beginning, liberal theology was meant as a term of criticism. But what happened to Bultmann, and I think that is really interesting, is that the very Bultmann who came up with the term liberal theology in order to criticize liberal theology was later on labeled as a liberal theologian. So you have the same process of labeling, I think, going on in that tradition. And so I could, I guess, already end my lecture by saying it's time for liberal theology to stop trying to revitalize the image of the liberal theologian. Many have tried, all have failed. Liberal is after all just a word. Wither the white liberal theologian. Rest in peace. They had a good run. Now it's time to imagine a future without them. But then again, this is the liberal lecture, so I probably won't get away with outing myself as a liberal theologian who hates liberal theologians. So I have to go a little bit deeper here. And there, I think Rick Benjamin's book, the English version came out fairly recently, formerly God, Rethinking God After God, is really helpful. Because Benjamin goes through the kind of modernist and postmodernist approaches to liberal theology to end up with what he describes as the signature of liberal theology. And he finds the signature in experiences and expressions of transcendence. There is quite a sort of heavy theological term in a way, transcendence, but if we think about transcendence as a verb, I think that helps. So we're looking theologically for moments where things are transcended, where things are bigger than we assumed, differently from what we expected, where we are surprised in a way. So this is what the idea of transcendence is after. So in a way, moments where we are surprised by being in the world, where the world transcends the world, became something else from what we had assumed it is. That's sort of what liberal theology really is interested in. And Benjamin makes the case that we have here an interesting connection between theology, talking about God, and anthropology, talking about human beings. So you cannot really talk about God without talking about yourself, and you cannot really talk about yourself without also talking about God, if you take this transcendence seriously. And Bultmann, of course, would have agreed with this. Whether he's a liberal or not is maybe not that interesting. And then he says, and I find that phrase really, really interesting and helpful. It resonates with me a lot to say, God takes shape in these moments where we experience kind of being transcendent and also try to express what happens to us there. In this expression, we sort of give shape to God. Now, maybe you know that Rick Bennis is also the one who sent the invitation for me to come here. But I'm not referencing his book only because I'm very grateful for being here, also that, but not only. I think what is interesting about this idea of God taking shape is that we can use it as a hermeneutics to look at different moments of religion coming up in the public sphere. And this is what I want to do today. So take this idea of God taking shape in the public sphere seriously and look a bit about that. But before I do this, I think one thing we have to keep in mind here is that this kind of theology that revolves around experiences and expressions of transcendence has a catch. And the catch of this theology is that in a way you can never settle on a specific assumption of what the world is. You can never settle on a specific assumption of what your individual or institutional identity is. Because the whole point is of all of these categories being transcendent, being transformed in the process. So it's a kind of, in a way, it leaves you a bit dissatisfied as a theology. You can never really settle and say, this is it. It always has to remain open. And there's sort of lots of negative ways to describe this, sort of in what it isn't rather than what it is. But not knowing Dutch that well, I find that the term Vrijzinnigheid in a way is a good word to capture that moment, that way of thinking, where you always have to be open to think against the closure of different types of identity. So I know that the Netherlands have a very rich tradition of Vrijzinnigheid and also Vrijzinnig theology in a way, and I've really barely scratched the surface of this. But bear with me when I say for this talk, I want to reserve the term for saying this is about the resistance rather than the reification of the construction of identity in the name of transcendence. So it's a call to remain open. And this call, I think, and here this is interesting, is not all of the liberal theological tradition has followed this call. I think you find lots of liberal theology that's actually closed and actively working for closure. But some theologians have, and some people are following this call now. And these are the people I'm interested in the lecture. So what I want to do now is look at certain policies of dehumanization and trying to think through how does God take shape in these kinds of policies. And then I want to look at certain practices of rehumanization and again ask the same question, how does God take shape in these kinds of practices? And then I will wrap this up by thinking through what can we learn here for thinking about theology and religion in the public sphere. And along the way, I will introduce you to a group of people who work. It's a multi-faith-based network that works with refugees across Europe. And what I want to show you is there, in a way, a public theology of Vrijzinnigheid in action, really. So this is where we'll get to. But first, the policies of dehumanization. This distinction between migrants and non-migrants that plays out in the policies at the Balearic Sea, who's being rescued and who isn't rescued, is a distinction that we take for granted in all sorts of contexts. Economically, socially, culturally, politically, we assume that there are migrants and that there are non-migrants. And in a way, that distinction also makes sense. You can think through certain rights that migrants should have and certain responsibilities that non-migrants have towards these migrants. So that's how this discourse about migrant and non-migrant, I think, works in the best case scenario. But as these unnamed graves on the Balearic Islands show you, we are not in the best case scenario. I would like to think that we're in the worst case scenario when it comes to thinking about migration in Europe, but in the 10 years I've been working on that topic, I've been surprised many times by how much worse it could get. So I don't know if we're in the worst place. We're definitely not in a good place here. And for me, the way I grew up, I learned to think about the European Union as this kind of attempt at international collaboration for the protection of human dignity. This is how I understood the European Union. And I still, working on this topic, I feel kind of grief. I'm sad about seeing that this European Union that says of itself it protects human dignity is actually doing the opposite. The border in the Mediterranean Sea is the deadliest border in the world. We are paying with our taxes for the deadliest border in the world. And this kind of dissonance, and it's not just a cognitive dissonance, there's more going on here, is something I want to stick with for the first part. So the first argument I want to make to you is to say that the migrant-non-migrant distinction builds and benefits, and then at the same time, builds and benefits from a discourse of dehumanization, and religion is crucial for the particularist and the universalist register of this discourse. I will explain these terms as we go along. I think the first insight here is to say that migrant and non-migrant are actually constructed categories. If you meet somebody on the street, you cannot say whether they are migrant or not. There's nothing in terms of the way they talk, or nothing gives it away, right? It's an abstract, a somewhat anemic category. So in a way to construct the distinction, we need to stick something onto it. So we can say we're migrantizing certain people, we're turning into migrants, and we're demigrantizing certain people. That language, that kind of approach comes from Regina Römheld and Naika Forutan, both scholars of migration that work at Humboldt University. They speak about migrantization and demigrantization, which I think are important terms here. So how does it work? How can one migrantize a person, and then by extension, how can one demigrantize a person? It has to do with what sticks to the distinction between migrant and non-migrant. We need to stick certain things onto that distinction to make sense of it, because otherwise it remains abstract. And this language of stickiness I take from Sarah Ahmed, a feminist thinker, theorist, who's written this book, The Cultural Politics of Emotion. And she says, while emotions may be experienced as inside out or outside in, so something we have or something that comes towards us, they actually work to generate the distinction between inside and outside in the first place. So what Ahmed says is, it's not us who have emotions, but it's rather emotions that have us. Emotions really make who we are. We're not, in that sense, rational creatures that can go over this. Emotions really shape us. And that means if we can attach certain emotions to certain categories, something happens. So Ahmed would say when a migrant and a non-migrant meet, what happens is that the whole history, the whole set of different associations and affects that we have when we think about migrants are activated in that meeting. So we cannot really meet each other neutrally. There's always a whole history that comes with us. So you can make this experiment for yourself. Think through when you think of a migrant, what sort of feelings come up in your mind? What sort of ideas, what pictures do you see? That's what Sarah Ahmed is after, this kind of knowledge. It's in a way an intuitive knowledge, an instinctive knowledge that we don't even have transparent to ourselves as a type of knowledge. It's like the air we breathe, the water in which fish swim. It's not something you normally think about. But it's important to think about it, especially for theologians, because I think religion is attached to this very distinction. So there's another process word, now I'm using this from Marianne Moyer-Erd, who's thinking about this as religionization. So the distinction between migrants and non-migrants is religionized. What do I mean by this? It's actually something very straightforward that study after study confirms. When Europeans think about migrants, they think about Muslims. And when Europeans think about Muslims, they think about migrants. The study that I've put the title here at the bottom of the slide, that's a meta-study, came out last year. It's really interesting. It goes through 100 studies that have been done, covering 50 countries and roughly 500,000 people. So it's really a broad study. And what they can confirm in the way people think about migrants includes anti-Muslim bias, persistent and pervasive. So this is really how we think about migrants. One of the traits we attach to them, we stick onto them. And of course this is a mistake. there are plenty of migrants who aren't Muslims, and there are plenty of Muslims who aren't migrants. But that doesn't matter, because the stickiness is an affective and an associative category. It's not necessarily a rational one. And of course, it harks back to a very long history of thinking about Islam in Europe, the history that Anja Topolsky is trying to bring onto the term of the race-religion constellation. And I think this is an interesting term because it calls to attention to two types of racism that kind of overlap in our thinking. On the one hand, we have the kind of color-coded racism. This is what we normally understand racism to be, so that attaches to skin color. You discriminate against a person based on their skin color. But there's also a culture-coded racism going on. And there, it's not based on skin color, but for instance, based on their religion, whatever makes them different from us. So we can talk about the culture-coded racism. And in this migrant, non-migrant distinction, these types of racism overlap. And if you think about the public debates we have about migration, they always come, or very often come, with also debates about Islam, politicized Islam. And the same with debates about Islam we have, they often come with debates about migration as well. So behind migration often lurks religion, and behind religion often works migration in the public debate we have. And of course, that also does something to Christianity. So think about it. Christianity is a religion, whatever you want to say about Christianity, it revolves around a Jew from the Middle East. But we tend to think about Christianity as the European religion par excellence. So we could say that in the discourse publicly, Christianity is being demigrantized and being de-religionized. We see it just part of European culture. It's not so much about religion, it's just who we are. While at the same time, Islam is being migrantized and religionized. And these two hang together. The more you migrantize the one, the more you demigrantize the other. It's like communicating tubes in the logic here. Now, why is all of this relevant? Why is that happening? I think that brings us back to this type of dissonance that I've been talking about. So Naika Forutan, she explains it like this. She says when it's about migration, she says the core conflict in sort of post-migrant societies, she calls them, is only on the surface about migration. In fact, the conflict is driven by the negotiation of equality as the central promise of modern democracy, invoking plurality and parity as principles. So, in principle, the European Union says we are protecting the dignity of every person, no matter where they come from. In practice, it's the opposite the European Union is doing at its borders. So this dissonance, we need to somehow sort out. This is our problem. And one way of sorting out this problem is to migrantize people and say they don't deserve to be here anyway. And there are different ways of doing this. And Anne Frank Zwilling, so Volker Heinz and Frank Wolf, they're both sort of cultural theorists, not theologians. But they've put this in the terms of a theodicy. So really, it's also kind of the core business of theology, or one of the core things of theology. So they argue this. Philosophy of religion asks how a good God can allow that innocent human beings are suffering, even though he has the power to prevent this suffering. Philosophers call this the problem of theodicy. But there's also a social theodicy that asks why societies that see themselves as humane allow for meaningless suffering even though they have the power to minimize it significantly. Now, if you know a bit about philosophy of religion, or theology for that matter, you know that normally what theologians do with theodicy problems is think about the concept of God. So this is where you sort of change a little bit how you think about God to make it still work out. What is interesting in this social theodicy here is that the problem is put not on the sovereign, which would in this case be the European Union, but actually on the suffering, the people who suffer under the borders. This is where we attach our problem and say, they shouldn't be here, they couldn't be here. And you find a universalist and a particularist register of this. The universalist version sounds nice. It goes a bit like this. You would say, we are all human beings, we share this. Of course, everybody should be protected. But the thing is, once these people come here, they don't really behave like we do. They don't really act like we do. They don't really fit into the way we live, and therefore we can't take them. So we really would, like in principle we are all for it, but in practice it just doesn't work out. It's a kind of universalist version. It sounds sort of nice, but in the end you keep people out. The particularist version is in a way more straightforward. You just say, no, we actually don't share one humanity in that sense. We really are very different people, and that means we shouldn't be living together, neither in practice nor in principle. The liberal theological tradition has often gone with this universalist version, and that has to do with the European Enlightenment that is so important for liberal theology. But that European Enlightenment is, of course, also really entangled in European colonialism and so on. And I think that's, so when I look at my own liberal tradition, I find this is something we haven't worked through well enough to think decolonially about what's going on here. Because the universalist and the particularist approach in the end have the same policy outcome, right? It doesn't really matter so much for the people who are drowning in the Mediterranean Sea, which way you had to keep them out. And so, to wrap this up, we can ask here what kind of God takes shape in these public debates. There's religion being activated here, especially Islam, but that activation of Islam, or saying these migrants are also Muslims, of course has consequences for Christianity. And the God that is implied here is a God that is protecting identities. Right? This system works because we can clearly say who is a migrant and who is a non-migrant and how they should never come together. So this is the public theology of dehumanization that is at work here. And I think this is really a theology, a way of seeing the world that is ingrained in us. This is what we get fed all the time. So it's very difficult to even get this into you, because we take this for granted, these debates about Islam, about migration. It's so much repeated in the public sphere. It becomes a kind of, like things of visceral knowledge. It's part of our body in a way. And so it's incredibly difficult to get out of this. Maybe it's even impossible to get out of this framing. But there is a group of people who are trying to get out of this. And this is now the second thing I want to show you. So the people you see here is, that group is called A World of Neighbors. And it's a multi-faith-based refugee relief network that's really active across Europe. So it's a bunch of people who work with people on the move. And say it's around 50 people. It fluctuates a bit, it really is a network. And most of them are in their 30s, but the age range is really from under 20 to over 70. And it includes non-religious people and religious people, Jews, Christians, Muslims, but also other traditions. And many of them have a history of migration themselves. And one person, some of you might know this here, can zoom in a bit, is Rico Forberg. He was earlier with us in the workshop. He's currently the director of that network. And I want to talk about this network not because it's a sort of very special, very big, very important kind of network, but I think it's none of these things actually, but I think something interesting is happening in that network, and this is the second argument I have for tonight. The conviction to care, or what brings these people together, plays out in practices of lived equality. I come back to this term, lived equality. These practices, so what A World of Neighbors is doing, are neither particularist nor universalist, but come with a new relationship between migrants and non-migrants that allows, or relationships that allow for a new visceral knowledge. So what I want to show you is, by the example of A World of Neighbors, how we can retrain our visceral knowledge to think about migration differently in a way that maybe doesn't require the migrant-non-migrant distinction. Lived equality is a term that I've taken from philosophical and sociological discourse. It's Jule Govrin and Laurie Beeman who've worked on this. Neither of them are terribly interested in theology. If they write anything about theology, they're very critical of it, but I think they're very good at getting at these types of practices. Where people come together and try to live equality in their day-to-day lives. And normally these are practices that we overlook. So this is Beeman's argument. She says these practices fail to meet the rather more demanding standards of grand political theory, or you could also say of grand political theology in a way. It's normally not what we look at as theologians, because it's sort of day-to-day practice is very mundane. But I think it's important to look at this. And the World of Neighbors started in Malmö in the 1920s. You probably know that Sweden was in 1920s, in the 2020s. Sweden was in 2015 the country that calculated per capita took in most migrants. And in Sweden, a World of Neighbors was started, and Malmö is the most diverse city in Sweden, and it's not far from where I live. There they had the first meeting, and they came up with a slogan to describe what a World of Neighbors is doing. They said, "Together we are keeping our humanity today and tomorrow." And it's a little bit after that summit that I joined them as a researcher, and since then I've been working with them. And I have to admit that from the very beginning I found the slogan very annoying. Because I think that slogan to me sounds exactly like this kind of universalist enlightenment thinking that is the problem rather than the solution to the problem. So I have been grappling in a way with what is going on here. And I'll come back to this. First I want to show you a bit what they're doing. So once a year, these group, they're really from all over Europe, they come together in summits, we call them, and then they think through their policies, through their practices, through what they do, and try to support each other. And it's really businessy, like there's lots of talking and sorting out stuff and organizing, but it's also quite a familiar atmosphere. So really from legal advice to love affairs, everything is talked about, and everything is really shared. So the budget is often tight, so we would share the rooms, we would share coffee and cigarettes, we would share the rations. That means everything is shared throughout the entire time. Worship is also shared, and I think that's quite interesting. So this is a group of people that includes non-religious and different religious people, Jews, Christians, Muslims, but every day there's worship, and it takes different forms, and there's always a bit of a surprise who's going to do it today and what's going to happen today, but there's always worship, and it's interesting, it's always packed, like people really show up for this morning worship. And there's also always some sort of party in the evening, so people also stick around. Here you see sort of people sitting around the bonfire, playing the guitar. There's so many bonfires I've sat around, so many hugs I've received. I suppose after the last summit, this is probably the highest hugging density of any place I've ever. And you know, I'm a German theologian, I don't hug. So there's something going on there in these meetings, but it's also, it looks a little bit like a youth hostel trip or something, right? It's nothing terribly special going on here, but I think this is important, and there is nothing special to it. This is precisely what I'm interested in. And so if you ask why am I showing you this, why do I think there's anything to this? I think one practitioner whom we interviewed put it like this. She said, well, I don't think there's any way we can exist together without, considering the fact that we are a multi-faith world. And I think that it doesn't mean that we have to come to some sort of agreement. Just working with the fact that some are believers, some aren't, we might believe different things. We might even believe, contradictory things, but we can still work together, or we have to work together. I think it makes a difference because it's something that has to be done by example. I think this is really interesting here. A World of Neighbors doesn't come together with a particularist or universalized version of this is who we are, this is what we stand for. It's actually constant grappling with difference. If you're there, and I've joined many of these summits, you are confronting the other people the whole time, from morning till you go to bed, with the difference that you bring. And you're confronted by their difference the whole time. In fact, even after you go to bed, because you hear the snoring in the shared room of the other person. So it not even at night, it stops. And this does not mean that this is sort of nice and cozy. There are real conflicts around stuff. I've seen conflicts around food, what dietary requirements can be accepted, can there be alcohol? And you imagine some very pious people and some very sort of lefty political activists. You can see how alcohol becomes a contentious issue in this. But often also, there's maybe not that much food. As I said, it's tight budget. I've heard people say, let's go out for pizza afterwards, sort of jokingly. But then others respond, that's not what we do here, or also in a jokingly friendly manner. So what happens is there's grappling, there are real critiques of the leadership since the beginning of this network. The leaders have always been criticized. And I think, again, this has to do with not letting these leadership positions, like poor Rico as a director, not letting him fixed as a leader, but saying, no, what you say also can be contested and is contested. Right? So there's real grappling going on. But I think that grappling is exactly the point. It's not the point to land on some solution saying, now we found a way of eating together that solves all the problems. And now we find a way of organizing ourselves that solves all the problems. No, it's we're eating together and we're organizing even though we can't settle on what this is all about. And in that process, I think a change in the relationship occurs, and that's this kind of slow process. A World of Neighbors has written about this. They say when accompaniment is rooted in the recognition that both the received and the receiving, so think the migrant and the non-migrant, are vulnerable in deeply human ways, then mutual transformation is possible. And it is in mutual transformation that lies the basis for any authentic friendship. So what happens here is a type of relationship building that goes beyond the migrant-non-migrant distinction. In a World of Neighbors, migrants are demigrantized and non-migrants are remigrantized. And this is not a one-off, this is not an easy thing. Of course, there's still people who have the right passports and people who don't have the right passports in this meeting. There's still inequality in terms of privilege and power. But there's constant grappling with this. And the idea that one can fix who is out and who is in, that's the idea that's not accepted. This is constantly changing. There's constant movement around this. And especially in this multi-faith network, the idea that a certain type of religion would mean a certain situation, a certain status, like Muslim equals migrant. That is what they're working on against. And one practitioner, I found it very interesting, he said, I'm here, this was in a group discussion, he said it to the others, I'm here because you helped me from becoming anti-migrant myself. I'm afraid of migrants, but through you, I can see that I don't have to be. So I said, this is not a one-off, this is a kind of habituation, a training, a new, different kind of knowledge. And Rico, in one publication where he talks about a World of Neighbors as a post-help praxis, he put it like this. Helping doesn't necessarily require personal relationships, so you can help migrants without being friends with them. But rehumanization does. And I have to learn to trust these men, women, and children when they tell me how important these moments of connection are, that these are true rehumanizing moments. So this is also a demand on the helpers, in a way, to trust this when people tell you, no, this really made a difference to my life. I think in a way I could stop here, because what you see here is a type of transformation of relationship that has to do with transcendence, in the sense that our identity categories here are being transcended. So in a way I'd like to say the public theology of a World of Neighbors are these practices. There's nothing else we need. But these practitioners do talk themselves about God from time to time. So I can give you some more propositional God talk if you're interested in this. So we've collected this, and it's interesting, we've never asked them about theology or God, but God has come up in several conversations. And this one here, I think, is a particularly telling example of how this works. So one practitioner has put it this way. Is there something beyond all these beliefs, beyond all these faiths and non-faiths, or whatever you would like to call it? We all appeal to love, the unconditional love that God is supposed to have. I think in most religions, God is associated to love, if I'm not mistaken. So it's basically saying the difference between theism and atheism is not an interesting difference for us. Faith or non-faith is not what's interesting here. And it is putting God in terms of a relationship between people. So the relationships are the point of departure and also the point of destination, in a way, for the God relationship. Same practitioner who continues, allowing for each of us as a vulnerable human being, as a complex entity. Perhaps we have this kind of thing going, and that's why we have also such beautiful moments, because we just let our societal characters behind. And it's, when you think of it from a religious perspective, it's like, we all have the image of God. So we don't consider each other as you are like this and you are like that, who in society would have a higher place than me. You're just a human being trying to help people on the move. And this is perhaps allowed by this narrative, this religious or spiritual narrative, which challenges our power relations, which are still very active. It's looking for this beyond notion, which is all too rare in our society. So theology, I think this is really full of theology, this statement like this. But what interests me here is in a way, it's a description of a moment of being transcendent. These beautiful moments that you describe are moments when you're pulled out of your own identity and turned into something different, or moments where you're pulling other people out of who they thought they were and something else happened. And I think love is really not meant romantically here. Love really is, in a way, if we think about falling in love, it really describes something that is not in our control. And this is what these people experience here and express. And by the way, the background picture, you can see me with my daughter at the top. So one way of keeping a world of neighbors alive between these summits is we meet online all the time. So there's a lot of online meetings going on. And I think I've reflected about this, the fact that I'm very happy for my 1-year-old daughter to join a long Zoom call, whereas otherwise I really try to minimize screen time, says something about the kind of relationships and meetings we have there. And I want to emphasize this is not just everybody's on the same page here theologically or religiously. There's actually, the quote I have here is from one very charismatic Pentecostal Christian who says this, also a practitioner. Everything is the same, just different. I don't need it, I don't want it. I appreciate it much more when somebody can say it very openly. From my point of view, believing in Jesus is a mistake, for example. It's fine. We can love each other because there's this level of trust. This person would probably tell you that Jesus is the only way. But at the same time, in a world of neighbors, he can say, it's fine when other people don't accept Jesus as the only way. And why? Because it's embedded in certain types of relationships that might be theologically more significant than the identity of description, saying you're the Christian, you're non-Christian, you're this or that. And one other practitioner I find, and that's the last theological quote I have for you, is where he summed this up and said, what we're doing, it is actually dialogue in practice. It doesn't have to be that we're talking about the Trinity of God. I think that's superficial, actually. And as a trained theologian, that gave me a bit of pause. We spent so much time in thinking and talking about the Trinity. And this practitioner is very educated philosophically and theologically, but he's not saying this because he got the Trinity sorted out. He's saying this because he makes a case about how do we talk about theology. Do we talk about theology in a way that's tethered to how we live? Or do we talk about theology in terms of doctrine that is abstracted from who we are, that allows for identity constructions? And he says that what we think intellectually is the most important deep stuff, that's actually the superficial stuff. And where the theology is really happening is in our practices. And you can say that all of this is maybe a little bit naive and maybe doesn't make a difference. But what happens, and I think that's where you can see how it makes a difference, is that these practitioners get in conflict with governmental but also non-governmental institutions, often their own religious communities. So one Muslim practitioner has put a bit of a joke in the group. She said, and I think that if you're not challenging your own community, that means you're not doing anything good. And then the whole group started laughing about this. So I think there you see that this is not just nice, airy-fairy, we all have such a nice time. This really has a political impact. And for me, I want to come back to this slogan, together we are keeping our humanity. I found it so annoying because I had misunderstood it. I thought the slogan is about humanity. Humanity is the key concept here. But after working this through, spending time, I think together is the key concept. It actually doesn't matter how the concept of humanity is filled. On the contrary, the point is not to fill that concept, but it's that we're doing this together, we're sticking together. That's the key category here. So again, we can ask, to sum this up, how does God take shape here? And the God that takes shape here is not so much tethered to religion, I think. That's maybe not the interesting category, but it is definitely experiences and expressions of being transcended. And of course, we can say these experiences and expressions, that's what the liberal theologian at least would say, is they are the basis for all religion. But here it can work in religious and non-religious ways. So even these self-identified atheist practitioners start talking about God in a way. To say, I don't believe in God, but here this makes sense to use this term. And it's a God that takes shape that hangs together with relationships and in a way lets us see a different world. So a world that is structured by policies of death becomes visible as literally a world of neighbors. This group is called the world of neighbors, and it does make sense. So our expectations in there are transcended. They're changed by this, and it's difficult to get this across. That's why I came with all the pictures and these quotes, because it's not something that you can just talk about. It is in a way something you need to be immersed in. So you should all come to an annual summit really if you wanna see how this works. It's not something one can really talk about. So where does this leave us? I'm wrapping up this talk. Where does this leave us in terms of public theology in the age of survival migration? I started by asking the question, are we human? And I started to think that through in the two versions of the we, the outsider, the insider, and that what we have to think through here is how theologies operate in these debates, in these discourses, in these practices, and in these policies. And so on the one hand, you have a dehumanizing policy that very much operates on the basis of the category of religion, the religionization of an essentialized difference between people. And on the other hand, you have kind of practices that maybe rehumanizing is almost too much, but at least you could say it is a resistance to dehumanization that you see. And that's not so much religionizing the difference, but in a way sort of changing the difference, keeping it movable. It's not that they can escape the world and where it matters whether you have a passport or not, or which kind of passport you have, but they can try to change the world around this. And you can say that a God takes shape in both of these practices if you want to think that through, but a God that has to do with transcendence in the sense of transcending what is going on, giving us more than we expected of our world, that is tethered to one of these practices. Now we can say this is terribly naive, and in a way it is terribly naive, but we could also say, and this is what I've learned from Laurie Beeman, the sociologist, she says, the accusation of naivete is itself a power play that allows the issuer to avoid contending with his or her own disbelief in the story being told. And living in the Europe in which we live, I think we very much need that story. So I choose to believe that story, even though I know it's also in a way naive. But I think this is the key point here. You can say what a world of neighbors is doing is not rescuing any person in the Mediterranean Sea. Right? Not one death less because of a world of neighbors. Not one deportation center less because of a world of neighbors. Not one policy of dehumanization less because of a world of neighbors. This is all ongoing. But if we want to think about the change that is required and the contribution that theology can maybe make to this change that is required in Europe, we have to think about the conditions for the possibility of change. And the condition for the possibility of change is that we get out of this visceral knowledge that puts the migrant, non-migrant distinction onto everything. And that's what a world of neighbors helps us to learn. So they're not bringing the change, but they're bringing the condition for the possibility of change. And I'm afraid this is for the moment all we have. It's a way of starting to think the we in the question, not as two different we's, but actually saying the we of us Europeans is entangled with the we of the people who are trying to get in. And the we of the people trying to get in is entangled with our we. And in that sense, that kind of transcending of identity categories that are so firmly in place, if we want to call that transcendent, that openness, if we want to call that Vrijzinnigheid, I say the Dutch word once more, then Vrijzinnigheid is a matter of survival. Thanks very much.
I'm happy to introduce Professor Dorothea Notch for a response to the lecture of Ulrich Schmiedel. And Dorothea Notch is Professor of Theology and Migration, a theologian and missiologist whose research interests include migration studies, mission studies, ecclesiology, Christianity in post-communist Europe, and innovative approaches to theology. And Professor Notch co-leads the PTHU Center for Theology and Christianity Worldwide and serves as president of the Central and Eastern European Association for Mission Studies and is an editor of the journal Acta Missiologiae. She studied theology in Budapest, Hong Kong and Utrecht and has worked as a theologian in many countries across Europe, including in collaboration with the University of South Africa, UNISA and the Max Planck Society. And tonight, she is willing to give us a reflection on Ulrich Schmiedel's lecture. Please give a welcome to Dorothea.
Good evening, everyone. And just before I start, please allow me to give honor to two persons in this room, Mr. Piet Pols and Mrs. Tineke Kuijtert, who have been journeying with people on the move for I don't know how many decades, taking them up in their homes and transcending borders of religions and confessions and political ideologies. It's such an honor to have you here, sitting here for many, like-minded. Dear Ulrich, dear Rick, dear co-listeners in this late Friday hour of a lecture which invites us and perhaps even urges us to engage in a deeper conversation with each other on the role of public theology in times like ours. Please allow me to begin my response by recalling an event, a happening, if you wish, perhaps God taking shape, which took place in Hamburg on the 2nd of June, year 2000, quarter of a century ago. It was the award ceremony for the prize of the Frauenkirchenkalender for Theopoesis, for divine poets. The celebrant was Carole Mosbach, a survivor of sexual abuse to whom God had to be stripped of all masculinities in order to survive. And the one who spoke to her was Dorothee Sölle, a survivor of another type, but certainly a survivor too. She started her speech in the following way, and I will adopt the English translation of the German original by Laureen Larkin, an Episcopal priest and PhD candidate working on a project on Martin Luther and Dorothee Sölle and how the concept of the self relates to freedom, responsibility, and resistance. On that June day, Dorothee Sölle started her speech like this. How can I praise God without lying? How can I open a way to speak to that which is truth of and about God? That is a question to which I also return again. When I went to Israel in 1960, I sought for the great Jewish philosopher Martin Buber. I had declared myself as a theologian. The conversation did not begin at all. At first, Buber kept silent. After a long silence, he said, Theology. How does one actually do that? There is, after all, no logos to theos. For the logos and God fit together, there is geology and other logis. But God is not an object of a doctrine, of a science. God lives in relationships. Yes, we can say God is relationship. God remains not in an academic edifice of dogmatically right clauses. These old remains of faith decompose today before our eyes. God desires to be related to, as it was understood long since in the Jewish tradition. Theopoetics, God poetics. In this way, we can speak of the experience with God instead of wishing to prove God. We say with American process theology, God happens. God come before. Last Tuesday afternoon, God suddenly appeared. So far the quote. And today, 60 plus years after Dorothee Söhle's meeting with Martin Buber, I wish I were able to visit one of the Sufi masters in Jerusalem. Not many of them are left there. And had some talks on theology. Well, I must confess I'm quite satisfied with the alternative I am offered tonight here with you, Ulrich. 60 plus years after the particular meeting between Buber and Söhle, in the ongoing history of hard labor of some to rescue theology from the domain of exact sciences and reconnect the logos with theos after the end of doctrine, in the line of the long-standing tradition of finding language, new language for God, you too, dear Ulrich, confront us, and invite us to reflect about the necessity of doing public theology, connecting logos and theos from the entry of a yes or no question, not really an academic one. Are we human? Yes or no? You do not easily give us your answer to this question, yet you quickly engage with Rick Benjamin's God's Take Shape formula, and by doing so, you make us understand that your cautiousness with filling in God with new words, your frustration in theology is historically and perhaps also biographically rooted. The religion language of the Theology disappointed many of us growing up in theological institutions which try to play theology as an exact science. The scientific language about God culminated not only in an essentializing God, but also in categorizing, labeling lives to the extent of dehumanization. And I am a child of the Cold War myself. We all have to do with the Enlightenment. The history of theology playing science has not yet come to an end. Modernity, even in its plural forms, continues. And relating to this heritage, like you, I am against any kind of theology which through categorizations, whether it is the migrant, non-migrant divide or the modern category of religion, conceiving of local and foreign gods, then leads to dehumanization. I too object to any kind of public theology which uses and misuses religion in order to migrantize and demigrantize people for the sake of preserving, essentializing imaginaries of Europe's social composition. And I wish to look at Europe in its actual state, not in states 200 years ago or not even 100 years ago. I would argue that migrantization of religion goes further than perceptions about the Islam. Think also of the migrant churches or how Christianity is used for that sake. And yet, dear Ulrich, I long for more than deconstructing, dismissing, and critiquing migrantization of religion and religionization of migration. And I may not be satisfied with experiences of suspended inequality by lived equality. I am having those experiences. I do agree that there is no way towards humanness without relationships in which the migrant and non-migrant divide is dissolved. And I rejoice with all those witnessing to God taking shape in relationships and resulting in new visceral knowledge. God taking shape through embodiment and shaping hearts, lungs, and all that is inside. I follow you in the messiness of the public theology, which suspends categories. I welcome the togetherness, creating and maintaining humanity. And you see how hesitant I am to give my Abba. What happens with the one we after the time slots of lived equality? And is there no homework to be done in thousands and one other ways in which we learn to speak new language about and with God? To what extent does the one we of lived equality necessitates the configurations, and I consciously use the term configurations, alluding to God who takes shape, figura, of multiple and different types of we, in which the link between logos and theos is created anew. And sorry for my students who are present here tonight, this is actually repetition, my mantra. Images, words about God will lead to embodiments. They will take shape. The talk we speak matters. Also, the talk about God matters. In our identification as theologians, we can't do too long without language about God, with God, especially not when it comes to discourses on migration, exactly for the reasons you elaborated in your first case, and you convincingly show us how God takes shape in dehumanization. Related to the we of the lived equality, we theologians might have the obligation to learn, to attend, yes, also to convert to a new language on God and with God, yes, for the sake of those who wish to act as God-believing, confessing, and voting citizens all over Europe and elsewhere on this world. Silence is important. Practice is needed. But words too are needed in order to be able to shape socio-political discourses on migration. Yes, perhaps through the killjoy joining Sarah Ahmed. And please forgive me if I doubt that the socio-political can be or should be suspended even in matters of lived equality. I don't think, nor do I feel, that we have the luxury to give up begging, searching, shaping, crying out to talk God, because words become flesh and words, thoughts, feelings will be embodied. Yes, they translate into policies and laws, and I believe that even the word of neighbors will translate into policies and laws. I am a bit more optimistic about that than you are, perhaps. They dismiss or maintain migrantization. Being and happening seem to always belong together. God language matters because theologizing communities seem not to decrease but increase in our days. Yes, claiming faith and confessing faith. Like mushrooms, they cover the earth and influence the climate we live in. And yes, in that sense too, there might be a we of all implicated subjects. This cautious arrival to my abels leads me to a second point, and you, the public, might see that we are other generation of theologians only having 2 points instead of 3 points. I wish to address in this response, and that is about the hermeneutical key you offer us. Vrijzinnigheid is a matter of survival. How does that link up to migration survival you are talking about? Whose survival is at stake at the end here? On this matter, I tend to resonate with the philosopher Mikhail Minakov, who urges intellectuals to go beyond the survival language when referring to liberalism. Talking about the we of those who take liberalism seriously, survival means much more than getting through it. Hoping that migrantization of religion and religionization of migration will sooner or later will cease, that better times will come, that autocratic leaders will not be elected and dehumanizing behavior will stop. We have long-standing memory of what we do plainly identify as evil, talking about language and talking about knowing what is good and what is bad. To quote Minakov, survival, elevated from condition to telos, is not liberalism. It is hospice care for a tradition that once claimed to enlarge the space of lawful peace and personal freedom, unquote. Yes, for liberalism as condition I go. For laboring, either friendship, I go with you, Ulrich. For a public theology in words and deeds, in a fashion of deep calls to deep, and perhaps here in Europe for getting even deeper in dealing with a theological heritage disguised in liberalism, but far from the reality of the bare lives of implicated subjects, of the rubber boats sinking and in the Mediterranean, or to the reality of the rubber boats sometimes bumping in the shores of Europe. Yes, let's continue to talk about the human condition, and let's continue to figure it out. Figure God out. God, figure us humans out. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dorothea. I think we have to talk. Thank you for your contributions to this evening, both of you. And we have about 10-15 minutes to look at the main points. First of all, I noticed that both of you agree that we have to leave the migrant-non-migrant divide. And somehow we have to deconstruct that language. But given the times we live in, this divide is very strong. What do you think about the opportunities to really deconstruct this language at the very moment? Are you seeing possibilities, or are you pessimistic about it?
Yeah, I guess I'm rather pessimistic. I think that came through the talk mainly, and that has to do with, so I've been working on the topic for, as I said, 10 years roughly, a little bit more, and I've been following A World of Neighbors, or been working with A World of Neighbors for maybe 5 years, and one thing I've noticed within A World of Neighbors is sort of an increasing pessimism that struck me. So I remember one of the first summits I attended, we had this exercise where people started dreaming of the Europe that we stand for. What is this Europe? And different people sort of chimed in, said things, and it was this real vision of a welcoming Europe, what Europe could be, what Europe should be. And as time progresses, I think this was also a much more hopeful time for these activists. What I hear now when we meet is, recently you brought up the term hospice. I think one of the activists in a recent meeting described what they're doing as palliative care. So they said, we are not dreaming about this big Europe anymore because we've lost hope in that. What we're doing is palliative care. We are relieving suffering on the spot because we are so under pressure, policies progressively getting worse, making the situation harder, that we have no space for these dreams left. So we are, in a way, easing the death. And when you see that sort of change over time, I mean, these are the most hopeful people I've met in my life, you know. And of course, they're also driven by some kind of hope. So they're continuing this palliative care because they are hopeful. But the nature of that hope has shifted. And I think it's not one that works around this sort of large-scale political change. Because, and this is what I tried to point out, that we don't have the condition of the possibility of that change yet. We can't think that way. So I think this is something we need to remind ourselves of, but to see a larger political change. The more I work on migration into Europe, the less hopeful I am about it.
I was very, very happy to hear that you confess that you believe in naivete. So in there I do recognize a sprinkle of hope. And thank you for sharing that with us. Whether we can go beyond the migrant-non-migrant divide, I work on that with all my strength and spirit and body and power. From my side, I think that the situation worsened in terms of migrantization because it's not only the migrantization of people, but it's also a migrantization of God. So in the last 20 or 30 years, since I follow the theology or theological reflections on migration, we are witnessing more and more systematic theologies formed or shaped through the metaphor of migration. And I think these developments are rather dangerous because they perpetuate the focus and the doctrine that migration, whatever that may cover, is a single issue. And if we critically look to each other, at least if I critically look to myself tonight, I did not formulate that sentence either. So we keep the focus on migration, and we did not explicitly link that to, for example, the issues of poverty or the issue of labor throughout worldwide. And there, in those paths, I see perhaps, indeed, paths to go beyond this migration-non-migration divide or migrant-non-migrant divide.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Just to pass on. Dorothea, you are telling Ulrich, if I'm correct, that he is too cautious filling in God with new words. Well, yes. Is that correct?
Well, I think we need that book cover, the white liberals, why white liberals hate white liberals. I think I would need that in my hands right now. Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and then of course, what would you respond to it, Ulrich?
I don't know, I think there's maybe some truth to it, but actually I don't, I don't like the way the terms are set in that way of phrasing the questions. So I feel like if you want kind of language around it, maybe I'm careful with the language, but I hope what I've shown is a kind of God taking shape in practices, in action, in, not escaping a sparse meal when you could go out and have a pizza yourself. I think these are not doctrinally clear formulas. These are not necessarily poetic formulas in a kind of literary sense of thinking about poetics, but I think there's a lot of, in a way, God taking shape, not necessarily God talk or God thinking. I think there's not so much. It did come up, but not so much. But there's, as a theologically, we can think through that as, God taking shape. And what happens if we put concepts on it, try to describe? Of course, we do, and I, in a way, did nothing but put concepts on it. I couldn't show you what this was like when we had this debate around the pizza and so on. So, of course, I'm putting that into language. And I think maybe my response would be, I'm happy for all sorts of God language as long as it stays movable. I think so. My fear around this is if we settle on a specific expression of the experience of transcendence, because then you basically prohibit transcendence. So the God talk starts to close the experience that the God talk is about. And in that sense, I think I'm very cautious with God talk, but I think for reasons, I like to think good reasons, to be careful with that.
Okay, thank you. I'm afraid I have to press you a little bit more with uncomfortable questions, but I will do so for the sake of discussion and clarity and coming together. If I understood you correctly, Ulrich, you more or less say that in a world of neighbors, in these meetings, there is something happening which makes the participants transcend themselves. And in that respect, something of God is not going to, transcendence is experienced because we open ourselves up. Well, that will do as a formula. Now, Dorothea wants to have a little bit more words to God, because words matter, she says. And she says what happens in these World of Neighbor meetings is more or less a short time slot of lived equality. There is a difference of interpretation there, I think. Is there, that will be the question to you, Ulrich, is there also the possibility of having a new God poetics or something like that, growing out of this self-transcendence as you experienced it in the world of nature? And would that be what you're after, Dorothea? That would be my question to you. So first, Ulrich.
So I think it's entirely correct that it's very difficult to translate these moments. I think that the suspended inequality, I think, is a very good phrase. I should have had that phrase. This is what happens in these meetings. This is suspended inequality in the knowledge of course, we're sort of going back into the world after the meeting, and then inequality is not suspended any longer. We're back to it. But there are attempts, I did the home group, because you asked also, are we doing our homework? So these Zoom meetings that I showed you one slide, we call them home groups. And this is a way for us to stay in contact throughout the year. There is, people visit each other as well, travel quite a bit. At the moment, plans of making national networks so that you could get all the Swedish. So Sweden has already started. We have a national network now in Sweden. So there are different ways, of trying to translate this into a long-term change of relationship. But I don't want to make this even more idealistic than I maybe am about describing this, in a sense. This is incredibly hard to change the way we think. As this one practitioner said, right, you keep me from becoming anti-migrant. When I disappear here, I all of a sudden have fear of migrants again. But something happens here that keeps me from it. So I think there are attempts at that, but it's really difficult to translate these types of relationship into a long-term sustainable model. There are also questions of scale, I think, that are really difficult here. So it's happening, but the challenge is big. And then the theology angle to it. So I think you can have a theopoetics around this, and I think some of the language I showed you a little bit, how the practitioners do this themselves. But in the end, I also wonder, so whom do we need this theopoetics for? Is that something that makes me happy as a theologian, or is that something that really can make a difference to the lives of these people? Like, who needs this theopoetics? And that I'm not so sure. So I think you can construct this. And I could also, as a theologian, try to summarize and systematize this maybe a little bit more and take some of this way. So you could really construct a theology of a world of neighbors. But I'm not so sure that would make a difference, that would be useful in any way. And this is the last thing I want to say about this. I think you're absolutely right in terms of words matter. But I would maybe be a bit more hesitant in terms of saying we start with the words that then are put into practice. I think that happens. But what also happens is that practices get translated into words. I think it works both ways. And we shouldn't forget the other direction, so that practices in search of words. So this has been more my approach, to say, like, what is going on here, and what do we have in the theological tradition of trying to name what is going on. So that, is it the word first or the practice first is probably a silly question, but it's something to keep in mind, that it's not only first the word and then the practice. There is a more complicated relationship, maybe.
Yes, I agree on that it's more complicated and mutual, like interactive relationship there between words and practice. Perhaps this is why I would stick to praxis, where words and practice come together. Take a very concrete example. Till 2015, within the politics in Hungary, the migrantization language was not so dominant. But then afterwards, or within, so it was a politically consciously adopted terminology to use the term migrants to people on the move, to asylum seekers, and that use of word led also to criminalization. So that's something which is, we live because of, or in the consequences of this language embodiment in such a real way, so to say. I think where I would like to ask to reflect upon is these suspended inequality time slots. They feel to me like a sort of ecstasies, like we found each other and we recognize in each other the humanity, who we are. And then we also recognize the frustration and the pain that we do not recognize the same humanity and may not have the same ecstasies in our own faith communities. And there, I think, my task as a theologian is also a serious one. Because in those little communities, I don't know how many people are in the services on one Sunday, we do develop still a God language or nurture a God language, which matters outside the walls of the church. So I think that my longing for finding and begging for words which connect theos with logos are also situated there. And I don't want to take too much of a time, but I wonder what have we done, theologians, in the last 30 to 40 years within or under the so-called secularization thesis within our faith communities. Perhaps it's joyful that we forgot a sort of theological language. I would say hallelujah, but what do we have instead?
That is a serious question, I think. And there is one more question you asked, Dorothea. Whose survival is at stake here? And I think we could all easily agree that the survival of those drowning in the sea is at stake. And with them drowning in the sea, our humanity is at stake. And liberal theology may be the last interesting thing to be at stake, because well, okay. Having said that, I would like to confront you with an article, Stine Jensen, a Dutch intellectual, an atheist intellectual, reflecting on religion recently. She is from Denmark originally. She wrote an article in NRC last Saturday. Progressive religion has to save us from autocratic leaders and thoughts. Do you agree? And has liberal theology, as much as we hate ourselves, has a task there or not?
Let me just give a start, but you don't escape. Even listening to this question, progressive theology, brings me back to a theological tradition which is very much rooted in modernity, with its central notion, progress. And I wish to say farewell to that.
Amen. Yeah, I think maybe let's play it this way. I think what you have, to me, I haven't read the entire article, but based on the quote you've given, this is exactly the type of universalist enlightenment idea that I think has far more often than not led to this drawing distinctions between worthy and unworthy life. So I think if we go that route, we end up in this kind of sort of universalism that in the end plays out in the same types of policies that any particularism would be. So having said that, I think there is some truth to a thinking, and that could also, what progressive could also mean that, a thinking that is very careful with identity constructions. And I do think there is something important here, a theology that maybe we say hates themselves, but a theology that can be self-critical as much as it can be critical with others, I think is really important for trying to stop these kinds of moments where systems are being closed. Because whenever a system is closed, then there is the fallout is death and dehumanization. And I do think theology is really important here. So this is not, so what I try to show is that there is, of course you can say, the theologian looks for theology and finds it everywhere, and probably there is some truth to this in my work, but I do think this is important. This matters what we do here. And in that sense, a liberal theology also matters. I'm not so happy anymore with this term. That's why I try to go with Vrijzinnigheid instead. It makes it a bit easier for me, especially since I don't understand Dutch. But I think there is something to that tradition, or these traditions, that is important in the current political moment. And we see everywhere kind of illiberal policies pumped up, propped up by illiberal theologies. So that alone makes me think there must be something worthwhile to the other side.
Okay, thank you for this conversation. I think we have to talk more about this, but we're not going to do this at this time, at this place. So thank you very much. Dear Ulrich and Dorothea, I would like to thank you on behalf of all present for your talks and for the discussion. And we would like to give you, as a symbol of our thanks, some bulbs from the Netherlands. Take care of them and make them flower, I would say. I'm going to close this meeting, and I'm going to do so by inviting you for a drink afterwards, of course, and I will do this in Dutch, and by announcing to you the liberal lecture of next year. Volgend jaar, 9 april, houdt Marieke van den Berg de Vrijzinnige Lezing. En dat staat ook op het programma dat u hebt gekregen. Ik heb een iets uitvoeriger toelichting van haar al gekregen wat ze wil bespreken. Wat ik hoop dat de titel uitdrukt, en de titel is Vrijzinnig verzet, overzoekend geloven, overtuigd activisme en morele moed. Wat ik hoop dat de titel uitdrukt, is dat ik op zoek wil naar de vraag hoe je vanuit vrijzinnigheid, die ik dan opvat als onder andere het aanvaarden van open geloofswaarheden, die steeds weer ter discussie kunnen worden gesteld, hoe je van daaruit kunt komen tot verzet of activisme wanneer de situatie daarom vraagt. Ik vermoed dat veel mensen intuïtief denken dat je, om in verzet te komen tegen onrecht, vanuit duidelijke principes en geloofswaarheden moet vertrekken. Hoe kan je geloof een bron zijn voor verzet, burgerlijke ongehoorzaamheid, activisme, wanneer je toestaat dat je geloofsverhaal onaf, warrig en open mag zijn? Dit is, gezien de huidige politieke ontwikkelingen, een heel reële vraag voor mij. En voor mij ook, zeg ik dan. En ja, dit lijkt mij een thema om door te denken op waar we het vanavond over gehad hebben. Dus 9 april volgend jaar. Ik zou zeggen tot dan en wel thuis.